Fog clings to the fields along the Illinois River like a secret that refuses to leave. You expect flat Midwestern plains, orderly corn rows, the pragmatic hum of modern life. Instead, you find stones that do not fit the story, mounds that refuse tidy explanations, and artifacts whose edges catch the light like questions. We come to Illinois expecting history to be a neat ledger, written in pottery shards and testable dates. But here, in the dirt that supports highway overpasses and farmhouses, history keeps interrupting itself, a broken pattern, a place where the quiet turns into a hinge and the hinge swings open only a sliver. Promise of answers is what pulls us in, radiocarbon dates that disagree, skeletons that seem out of scale, trade goods from faraway places that make you wonder who walked these trails and why. I want to take you there with me, not as an expert lecturing from above, but as a companion with a torch, whispering the stories science has mapped and the corners it hasn't illuminated. We will look at dates and maps, at artifacts catalogued in drawers and at myths whispered in local taverns. We will stand in the cold morning mist at the lip of an earthwork and imagine the drumbeat that might have raised stones into place. I promise complexity. Some of these mysteries have neat hypotheses and messy evidence. Some have neat evidence and messy hypotheses. But that tension, between what can be measured and what we feel in our bones when standing in an ancient place, is where the story lives. Keep your sense of wonder ready and your skepticism sharpened. Both will be needed. Let me begin with a scene. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn along the Sangamon River Valley, reeds wet with dew, the horizon a slate that is almost, but not quite, empty. In the distance, a low rise, it appears at first to be a mound of earth, one of the many Native American earthworks that dot the state. As you draw nearer, you discover patterns in the soil, terraces cut into the slope, alignments that line up not with the road but with the sunrise on a particular late April morning. Archaeologists will call these features by function and date: Middle Woodland, 1,800 years ago, pottery types, mound building cultures. But there's another detail the scientific ledger often leaves as a note: a single stone, out of place, that seems older than the filling around it, or an unusual bead that traces a route of trade all the way to the Gulf Coast. You read the catalog and then stand in the field, and the human element, the person who chose that stone, the child who left a toy, the traveler who passed by in a canoe, returns. The cliff between the measurable and the imagined is short here. We will cross it and cross back again, because both sides are necessary. We will be fair: modern archaeology in Illinois has mapped more carefully than most regions. Radiocarbon labs and careful stratigraphy have pulled many of these sites out of rumor and into the ledger. But here's where it gets tricky: some finds do not layer neatly. You can date charcoal from a hearth and get one date, and the clay vessel above it will give another that pushes the occupation earlier or later. Bones with odd pathologies suggest people with diets and lifestyles that do not fit the known culture for that period. Then there are objects: copper that came from the Lake Superior region appearing in a mound with pottery styles from the Ohio River Valley, beaded necklaces whose glass came from distant trade networks, or carved stones that appear out of sequence. These contradictions do not mean the field is broken. They mean the story is more entangled than our neat boxes allow. Still, for all the evidence, the archaeologists are careful, and we must be careful with their work. There are anomalies that resist tidy interpretation. Those anomalies are the heart of what I want to show you, places where science has excellent tools, but the human past keeps a few tricks up its sleeve. One such place begins in the limestone bluffs along the Mississippi, where the skeletons unearthed a century ago were either ordinary people or a set of bones that, according to some accounts, were unusually large. The headlines at the time loved the idea of giants. The cautious notes in museum catalogs favored mismeasurement, incomplete skeletons, and wishful thinking. The truth is more interesting. When archaeologists return to the field with modern methods, they find fragmentary remains of larger individuals, or at least individuals who lived lives we do not fully understand. Consider the context: an isolated burial with a cache of exotic shell beads from the Gulf, copper ornaments from the far north, and a flint point stylistically similar to examples hundreds of miles away. In the ledger, this is a sign of long-range trade and social complexity. In the imagination, this is someone who was connected to a network of exchange, perhaps a leader or a person of ritual importance, whose remains were later romanticized into legends of giants. Picture yourself at that bluff at twilight, wind coming off the river, and feel the smallness of a single body against the sweep of trade routes and myths. The scientific questions pile. Were these people physically different due to diet or genetics? Did their culture practice cranial deformation or other body modifications that make measurements misleading? Or did later storytellers, hungry for the spectacular, inflate the size of ordinary burials into tales of giants? We still don't know. Move inland and imagine a low plateau where, beneath the cornfields, archaeologists have mapped an expansive geometric earthwork, squares, circles, and precise embankments, whose lines run so straight in places that you could believe they were drawn by a modern surveyor. These are not unusual in the Mississippi Valley, but the sophistication in some Illinois sites is striking. Some of these sites align with astronomical events, others mark multiple phases of use over centuries. Radiocarbon dates collected from the embankments sometimes cluster and sometimes scatter. Pottery styles change across the site in ways that suggest a long-lived, adaptive population rather than a single sudden construction. The key discoveries here include human burials with grave goods, charred botanical remains that reveal diets, and traces of structures suggesting houses placed on raised platforms. How to interpret it? One theory posits ceremonial city-states with seasonal gatherings and regional hierarchies that manage long-distance trade in copper, shell, and exotic lithics. Another suggests ritual landscapes, places more important for pilgrimage than permanent settlement, a kind of sacred topography where groups met for rites and trade. A third proposes that changing climates and shifting river courses forced populations to adapt, leaving a palimpsest of constructions and reconstructions. But here's where it gets tricky. Some embankments seem to incorporate boulders not native to the immediate valley, implying labor and organization beyond what simple villages could muster. Imagining a procession, drums echoing through the night as work parties move stone and sod, brings the place to life. Still, for all the evidence about construction and use, we cannot say with certainty what a single embankment meant to the people who raised it. We still don't know. Then there are the relics that whisper of faraway seas, gulf shells carved into pendants, and spiral beads found hundreds of miles north of any coast. When you hold one in your hand, you feel the reach of ancient voyagers across river highways that are the continent's veins. Trade routes in pre-Columbian North America are not theory. They are visible in the layers of artifacts that span vast distances. But the details are messy. Which items moved as prestige goods carried by elites? Which moved with merchants and families? Which moved across networks of reciprocal exchange where identities and obligations spread objects like small contracts? Some theories emphasize centralized control, elites accumulating exotic goods to bolster status, while others emphasize decentralized exchange. The presence of marine shells in an Illinois burial raises further questions. Were these people voyaging to the coast, or were they part of a long chain of exchanges? Did the shell itself carry mythic meaning because it came from the sea, or was it prized merely as a rare object? Picture yourself on a canoe gliding through a fogged river at dawn, the paddle whispering, and imagine the silent commerce that moved beads where no postal routes existed. We still don't know. Consider also the curious inscriptions and carved stones that sometimes appear, weathered and ambiguous, in unexpected places. Not all of these are old, some are colonial graffiti and some are modern hoaxes. But a handful resist easy dismissal: petroglyphs whose lines do not match known iconographic systems, or carved grooves on limestone that suggest a tool technology or symbolic system we do not yet understand. These marks can be tiny, easy to miss. They can be giant, like a face staring out of a cliff face. What do they mean? One line of thought treats them as mnemonic devices, landscape maps, or calendars. Another favors ritual symbolism tied to ancestor veneration or totems. A third suggests practical purposes, boundaries, navigational markers, or locations for specific resources. The difficulty is always context. Marks found alone on a stone are hard to date. Marks found with stratified deposits are easier to place but still stubborn. Now, let's be fair, interpretation must rest on comparanda and careful analysis. But the evocative power of such marks, the way a carved groove seems to catch the evening sun and change the slope of your imagination, cannot be discounted. We still don't know. And then there are the stories the land tells in its anomalies, sudden depressions that geomorphologists sometimes read as sinkholes but which local lore remembers as collapsed ceremonial chambers, patches of soil where magnetic surveys detect unusual heating consistent with intense ancient burning, lake beds with layers of charcoal suggesting catastrophic fires or ritual clearance events. Science provides tools, pollen cores, sediment chemistry, dendrochronology, that often confirm human involvement. Yet the events that cause those layers, the motivations and the social consequences, remain open. Did a catastrophic fire lead to population displacement? Was it a ritual event designed to clear and consecrate a space? Or was it climatic, a drought-driven conflagration that the people later reinterpreted? Picture yourself standing on the rim of a dried lakebed in late summer, heat moving across the cracked earth, and hearing the echo of the people who lived there. Still, for all the physical data, the human story that links cause to consequence is partial. We still don't know. This will take us to contested excavations and the messy history of archaeology itself. For every meticulous survey there is a story of early collectors who dug without context, removing objects whose provenance was never recorded. A display case can show a beautiful pottery fragment, the storage log might say, "Found near Peoria," and nothing more. When we reconstruct narratives from incomplete data, we must be humble. Some early finds became the seeds for grand theories, now tempered, sometimes overturned by modern analysis. At the same time, the early reports, however flawed, sometimes contain details lost to later reworking of the land. Fence posts are put in, cornfields plowed, basements dug. The living landscape masks the past. We are left reading palimpsests, soil layers, museum ledgers, and the stories people tell. The interplay between the physical record and the oral record is complex. Oral traditions, stories of lost villages, of stones that moved in the night, of a people who vanished after a harsh winter, often survive where stratigraphic clarity does not. Mythic elements, lost tribes, cursed stones, giants, get woven into these oral traditions, sometimes obscuring and sometimes preserving kernels of truth. We must respect both the rigor of the lab and the memory of the community. We still don't know which stories will prove fertile and which will remain beautiful but speculative. As we walk these sites and sift through the ledger of bones and pottery, one question keeps returning: how much of pre-contact North America is an archive of routine human life, and how much of it is a graveyard of intentional spectacles, dramatic constructions meant to impress, to transform, to bind people together? Some earthworks are practical, some are ceremonial, some are both. The challenge is separating function from meaning across deep time when the culture that made the decision has vanished. Here is a thought experiment. Suppose you could ask a single person who lived in one of these communities why they shaped the land the way they did. They might answer plainly: to mark our dead, to celebrate our harvest, to call the rains. Or they might answer in a story, a mythic account that binds the people to place with cosmological force. We, looking back, must entertain both levels, practical and mythic, to approach the full human truth. Now imagine, for a moment, one of those moments of revelation that shiver through archaeology, the trench edge where the soil color changes and a dark line of charcoal begins. In that cut the world compresses, charcoal for dating, tiny bones for diet, pollen for the seasons, slivers of lithic for trade. You feel like a reader turning a page and finding a single sentence that flips the plot. These moments happen here in Illinois with some regularity: a hearth out of place, a bead far from its source, an embankment aligned with a solstice sunrise. Each one is a telescoping view into a life. Each one is also incomplete. The open questions persist, not because archaeologists are incompetent, but because human lives leave partial traces. The job of the scientist is to be rigorous about inference and generous about imagination, because to reconstruct the past we need both. I want to end this opening by inviting you to stand with me at dusk on a bluff above the Illinois River, when the sky colors the water like poured metal and the herons lift in silhouette. Feel the wind, hear the susurrus of grasses. Picture the people who once moved there, carrying shells and copper and songs across rivers, drawing lines in the earth to mark the world. Some loved and died in those lands, some organized labor to uplift embankments, some traded along networks that spanned hundreds of miles. Science gives us measures and probabilities. Wonder gives us the human scale, the story we can hear in the wind. Together they make a better story than either alone. We will now step into 6 to 8 scenes across Illinois, places that hold bones, stones, and stories, and we will listen closely to what the earth says and to what it coyly withholds. Keep your feet on the ground and your mind ready to be surprised. We still don't know. Picture the towering silhouette of Monk's Mound at Cahokia rising out of the flat prairie like a deliberate, human-made hill against the horizon, not a natural rise but a terraced, stepped platform lifted by hands and sweat centuries ago. One sentence. Cahokia, the city of mounds on the Mississippi floodplain, was once the largest human-built landscape north of Mexico, and it still refuses the simple labels we tried to put on it. At its peak, sometime after 1050 CE, Cahokia reorganized the river plain into plazas, ridges, and massive earthen pyramids. Monk's Mound itself, the largest prehistoric earthwork in North America, soars the equivalent of several dozen modern stories and covers an area that would dwarf many European castles. Precisely dated tree-ring samples and radiocarbon assays placed the city's fluorescence in the 11th to 14th century CE. Pottery styles, maize agriculture residues, and house patterns show a population that was both deeply local and astonishingly connected. Key discoveries here are the enormous plaza spaces that could hold thousands of people, the causeways that radiate from the central precinct like spokes, and the rich burials with copper ornaments, marine shell gorgets, and beads, objects that trace trade routes reaching to the Gulf of Mexico and the Great Lakes. But here's where it gets tricky. Cahokia seems to have been built quickly and then reorganized repeatedly, which suggests political dynamics more fluid than the old model of a static chiefdom. Some archaeologists read the architecture as evidence of centralized authority, an elite class that mobilized labor, redistributed maize and goods, and controlled ritual life. Others argue for a more networked model, seasonal gatherings of kin groups and ritual specialists who returned each year, temporarily swelling the populace and reshaping the landscape through collective ceremonies. Now, let's be fair, both readings have strong support in the material record. The plaza scales and the labor investment argue for organization at a level beyond a small village, but isotopic studies of human teeth show individual mobility that hints at porous boundaries, marriages, and migration that complicate a strict top-down hierarchy. There are frictions too, evidence of sudden abandonment, and shifting building phases raises questions about climate, resource depletion, or social unrest. Some researchers point to a series of floods and droughts documented in sediment cores and tree rings as triggers for social stress. Others suggest that political fragmentation or shifting religious practices made the city unsustainable. Embedded in the scholarly debate is a human drama, a place where ritual and economy braided together so tightly that a crisis in one could unravel the other. Mythic threads have been woven into Cahokia's memory as well, stories of lost kings, of a plaza where giants once danced, or of a great mound that marks the throne of a sun king who returned each solstice. These tales are modern, poetic overlays, but they point to the very real possibility that Cahokia's architecture and objects were meant to broadcast a story: who belongs, who leads, and how the cosmos orders life. Picture yourself at dawn standing on the plaza's edge, the grass wet and the air cold, thinking of the hundreds of pairs of feet that once pressed that same soil for festivals and funerals, while the river carries reed and canoe and rumor downstream. Still, for all the measurements, for all the dates and artifacts and the boldness of the earthworks, we still don't know what single combination of social, ecological, and ideological factors finally led to Cahokia's decline, and we still don't know the full texture of daily life among the millions of small decisions that built and unbuilt that city. We still don't know. Further inland, imagine stepping into the layered, almost library-like deposits of the Koster site, where the ground records a very long human presence, as if someone had written generations on successive pages. One sentence: Koster preserves more than 8,000 years of continuous occupation in a single valley, giving us a rare, long view of how living in this landscape changed from forest foragers to settled farmers. In the trench walls you can watch the color of the soil change and read the sequence. Deep deposits of hearths and post holes and chipped stone, each a chapter in the human story. The site includes deeply stratified components, early archaic hearths with tiny, delicate projectile points, middle woodland features with elaborate ceramic traditions, and later Mississippian layers where maize becomes a staple and houses sit in more permanent rows. Key discoveries include human burials with grave goods that shift in complexity over millennia, botanical remains that demonstrate transitions in diet, and successive house floors that show changes in settlement patterns. Trade appears repeatedly, lithic raw materials sourced from hundreds of miles away, suggesting long exchange networks even for small hunter-gatherer groups. Interpretive responses vary. One theory emphasizes cultural continuity and local adaptation. Long-term residents learn to exploit a changing landscape through accumulated knowledge and incremental change. Another theory underscores punctuated shifts. Technological introductions or intermittent migrations brought abrupt cultural innovations that remade local lifeways. Still, for all the methodical care in excavation, careful stratigraphy, radiocarbon sequences, and microbotanical analyses, the Koster sequence contains episodes of sudden change whose cause is debated. Were these population movements, climatic shocks, or internal social reorganization? In the public imagination, the deep time preserved at Koster fuels mythic resonances. Lost tribes whose memories stretched back to a world where deer and river defined daily life, or survivors who adapted to new crops with a ritual austerity that later peoples misremembered. Picture yourself in a dimly lit lab, peering at a tiny shard of charred maize under a microscope and realizing that this fragility is the thread connecting you to a family who stored kernels in an earth pit 9 centuries earlier. The reflective insight here is almost painfully simple. Long-term occupation is not mere continuity. It is a testament to human resilience and to the cumulative knowledge that turns a precarious environment into a lived landscape. Still, for all the chronological sequences and the meticulous catalogs of stone and bone, we still don't know the intimate social rules that governed kinship, how disputes were resolved, which rituals bound the community, and who felt themselves outsiders. We still don't know. Not far from where the river bends lies a cemetery site whose displays and museum cases have been both a source of knowledge and of controversy, a place where the dead have been pulled into public stories and messy politics. One sentence. Burial complexes like those at Dixon and the Havana-engaged cemeteries show intricate mortuary practices, sometimes mass graves, sometimes richly adorned individuals, that imply social differentiation, ritual complexity, and stories that communities chose to remember or forget. Excavations have produced skeletons wrapped with shell beads, copper plates, and distinctively incised pottery, alongside less adorned graves. Some burials show signs of violent death, others of careful, repeated interments. Anthropological analysis reads diets from bone chemistry, and burial position and grave goods suggest age, gender, and status markers, but interpretations are fraught. One hypothesis argues for strongly hierarchical societies where elites accumulated prestige goods and controlled ritual access. Another treats the pattern as situational, differential treatment based on life achievements, kin alliances, or clan affiliations rather than inherited rank. Complicating matters are issues of repatriation and interpretation. Museums long displayed artifacts removed with little context, provoking rightful critiques from descendant communities who demand that stories of the dead be told with respect and accuracy. Mythic overlays here are potent. Legends of cursed burial mounds, of bones that call the weather, of giants whose graves mark the valley. Those stories often misrepresent the archaeological record, but they also signal that these places were not simply garbage heaps. They were charged with meaning. Picture yourself at twilight walking the edge of a field where a burial mound rises like a small hill. A local elder speaks softly of ancestors and taboo, and you understand that scientific categories are not the only ones holding the place together. The reflective insight is that how we treat the dead says as much about us now as it does about people then. Still, for all the osteological data and the careful typologies of grave goods, We still don't know the full symbolic grammar that decided who received a shell gorget and who received a simple wrapped bundle, nor the pace and mechanisms through which social differentiation crystallized. We still don't know. There are also the scattered, beguiling signs of long-distance connections that look almost like postcards from other worlds: Gulf of Mexico shells, Lake Superior copper, and marine-derived beads appearing together in a single Illinois context. One sentence. These exotic goods are proof that rivers and trails functioned as arteries of exchange, forming a continent-spanning web of movement that included objects, people, and ideas. Technical analyses, isotopic signatures, trace element studies, and petrographic microscopy can often pinpoint where a piece of copper or shell came from, and those results are startling. A copper pendant recovered in an Illinois mound can often be traced back to deposits near Lake Superior. A conch shell gorget will have chemical fingerprints matching shells from the Gulf Coast. The presence of such materials begs questions. Were these the goods of distant elites, exchanged in ritual contexts to cement alliances? Or were they commodities carried by traders like portable currency? A theory of prestige goods exchange argues that exotic items were concentrated by social leaders to reinforce status. An alternative model emphasizes decentralized, reciprocal networks where objects moved in many hands and served as tokens of obligation. The mythic imagination has always loved the idea of a great voyaging people, ancient mariners who mapped inland seas like highways. But the record is more likely to show a mosaic of movement patterns, some episodic and some sustained. Picture yourself paddling a birch canoe on a dawn river, feeling the rhythm of the paddle and imagining the slow, patient logistics of trade in a world without wheeled carts. The key reflective point is that objects are not inert. They carry stories, obligations, and cosmologies. Still, for all the provenance studies and the careful mapping of trade routes, we still don't know whether the flow of exotic goods reflects conquest, commerce, marriage exchanges, spiritual pilgrimage, or an always shifting blend of motives. We still don't know. Then there are the enigmatic carved stones and petroglyphs that punctuate Illinois cliffs and outcrops in ways that make the modern eye search for a key. One sentence. The carved grooves and motifs scattered across limestone surfaces suggest symbolic systems that do not always map neatly onto the iconographies we recognize from the eastern woodlands, leaving open whether they encode calendars, clan symbols, territorial markers, or something else entirely. Some of these marks are simple, repeated notches that could be mnemonic counters, while others are more elaborate, perhaps representing stylized faces or animals. Dating such marks is notoriously difficult. Where archaeologists can secure context from associated deposits, interpretations become more robust, but in many cases the rock art sits exposed and ambiguous. Scholars propose practical explanations, boundary markers or navigational aids, and ritual ones, ancestor veneration or cosmological mapping. Now, let's be fair. Some rock art in the broader Mississippian world aligns with cosmological motifs that repeat across sites, tying foreground myth to known ceremonial practices. But in Illinois, some marks simply resist comparanda, as if they belong to a local dialect of symbol making we have yet to learn to read. Popular accounts have turned a carved groove into a curse-marked stone or the signature of a god, creating romance but little analytical traction. Picture yourself on a rain-slick rock tracing the grooves with a gloved finger and feeling the chill of time. The grooves become a kind of handwriting to be deciphered. The insight here is that symbols work at many scales, personal, communal, and cosmic, and the loss of a living culture's interpretive key leaves us translating half-remembered metaphors. Still, for all stylistic comparisons and contextual excavations, we still don't know the literal meaning of many of these carvings, nor the ritual frames in which they were created and used. We still don't know. Finally, think of the places where geomorphology and human action collide: collapsed pits, buried hearth complexes, and soil anomalies that tell of sudden events. One sentence. Sedimentary cores and magnetic surveys reveal episodes of intense burning, rapid sedimentation, and sudden landscape change that hint at either catastrophic events or purposeful, large-scale transformations by human hands. Sediment cores from ancient wetlands sometimes show thick layers of charcoal that suggest intense burning over a short period, pollen analysis can show abrupt declines in tree species consistent with landscape clearance or climate perturbation. Some interpret these layers as evidence of episodic environmental catastrophe, drought-induced fires or extreme flooding, while others see organized, ritualized landscape burning to manage habitat for game and agriculture. The methodological tools, pollen, microcharcoal counts, and geochemical markers, are powerful, but they cannot always distinguish human-caused fires from natural ones with certainty. The different scenarios lead to very different social narratives. A people responding to climate stress will exhibit different institutional resilience than a people intentionally engineering the landscape as a long-term policy. Imagine standing at the rim of a dried bog where the crusted soil shows black flecks and feeling the sense of an event that changed everyday life. Whether remembered as a famine or a purification rite, that event would be a pivot in communal memory. Reflectively, these layers remind us that humans are both actors and reactors in environmental history. The land shapes people even as people shape the land. Still, for all the high-resolution proxies and careful fieldwork, we still don't know which combination of causes created specific sedimentary anomalies at any given site, and we still don't know how contemporaries understood those events in mythic or pragmatic terms. We still don't know. Picture the painted bluff above the Mississippi where the Piasa image once startled river travelers, a creature of wings and fangs rendered in the thin, red lines of European-era observers who wrote down a memory that likely traces back to a deeper, older set of images. One sentence: the Piasa and similar cliff face figures are more than local legends. They are nodes where icon, memory, and landscape meet, and they force us to ask whether a single painted image can hold centuries of shifting meaning. Historically, the first written accounts of the Piasa come from 17th-century voyagers who described a monstrous bird painted by native people on a high bluff, though oral traditions and the possibility of earlier graphic traditions suggest layers that predate those reports. The visual form the Europeans recorded, part bird, part horned animal, sits uneasily with the more familiar animal figures of neighboring cultures, which raises questions about stylistic influence, mythic hybridity, and the processes through which images transform as stories travel. Key discoveries around river bluffs include pigment traces on sheltered rock faces, nearby shell-tempered pottery in adjacent midden deposits, and occasional narrow ledges that could have served as stages for seasonal rites. But here's where it gets tricky. Weather, flood, and human repainting make it hard to date any surviving pigment securely, and old travelers' reports often mix observation with hearsay. One line of interpretation treats the Piasa as a totemic or clan emblem, a marker of territorial identity that used dramatic placement to warn or welcome river users. Another reads it as a mythic beast in a cautionary tale, a narrative device that encodes moral or cosmological lessons, yet a third considers it an imported motif. Perhaps the product of long-distance story exchange where coastal and inland mythologies braided together. Now, let's be fair. The Piasa's later literary life, retellings that turn it into a monster devouring explorers, says as much about American frontier imaginations as it does about indigenous symbol systems. Mythic elements are unavoidable here, stories of winged giants, of cliff saints who once guarded river crossings, and of painted guardians that drank the blood of enemies thread through the accounts like bright red dye. Picture yourself standing at the river's edge on a cold morning, looking up at the bluff and imagining a painted creature visible only when mist recedes, the toes of its talons catching the light, while canoes slip silently below. The reflective insight is that images in the landscape are conversation pieces across generations. They speak to identity, memory, and the deliberate act of saying, "This place belongs to a story." Still, for all the pigment residues in traveler journals and the careful ethnographic parallels, we still don't know exactly when the original image was made, what precise stories it encoded for the people who painted it, or how many hands and seasons reshaped its meaning over time. We still don't know. Think next of the places where water hides time, river bends and oxbows, ancient channels now buried beneath alluvium, and lake beds that keep the cold secrets of human occupation beneath silt. One sentence: submerged landscapes across Illinois, ancient shorelines, buried forests, and sunken settlements, preserve fragments of lives erased by shifting water and sediment, and they complicate any tidy narrative we try to build from dryland archaeology. In the wake of glacial retreats and millennia of river dynamics, whole occupation surfaces were drowned or buried, leaving artifacts and ecofacts trapped in anaerobic mud, which sometimes preserves organic materials far better than dry contexts. Key data come from cores and sonar surveys that reveal peat layers, buried soil horizons, and concentrations of cultural debris like fire-cracked rock, worked bone, and charcoal lenses. When archaeologists and gearchaeologists radiocarbon date preserved organics from these submerged contexts, sometimes the results stretch the timeline of human presence in a valley, showing earlier use than nearby dry sites suggest. But here's where it gets tricky. Waterlogged deposits are dynamic and can be reworked by later floods, complicating stratigraphic interpretation. A polished wooden paddle preserved in a peat bog might have been dropped centuries apart from a stone tool displaced by later channel migration. Competing theories about submerged finds range from the prosaic. These are the remains of routine seasonal camps now hidden by later river behavior, to the dramatic, intentional inundation of ritual spaces or catastrophic flood events that rearrange settlement patterns overnight. Mythic overlays are seductive in these watery places. Tales of sunken villages that surface in full moonlight, of bones rising in fish-strewn water, and of drowned ancestors calling from the depths. Picture yourself standing in a small boat over a silted marsh, dragging a corer and feeling the sudden resistance when you hit an organic layer, then imagining a family hearth warm under that cold, gray paste. The reflective insight here is ecological and humane. Water is both memory and eraser, and the places people left behind often become the very traps that preserve them. Still, for all the promising cores and the occasional submerged timbers that yield dendrochronological sequences, we still don't know the full extent of human occupation hidden beneath Illinois' waterways, nor the precise moment-by-moment processes that determined what was preserved and what was lost. We still don't know. Turn now to the bones themselves. Not only human remains but the great mammals that shared the landscape, mastodons and mammoths whose bones sometimes appear in clay pits and gravel bars, collapsed into mud as if the earth kept a ledger of their last steps. One sentence. The Pleistocene megafauna that once roamed Illinois are part of the same story as its human occupants, and the traces where their worlds intersect raise urgent questions about hunting, climate, and the human role in extinction. Fossil finds in Illinois include isolated mammoth and mastodon bones and, less commonly, stone tools found in association with megafauna remains. Radiocarbon dating of bone collagen provides age ranges that, when paired with regional paleoclimate records, suggest that humans and big mammals overlapped for long, complicated intervals. The discovery of worked bone or chipped lithics in close proximity to megafaunal remains invites theories of human predation, yet the taphonomic record, the way bones are broken, gnawed, or weathered, often resists simple reading. One theory holds that human hunting pressure accelerated local megafaunal declines in the terminal Pleistocene. Another emphasizes rapid climatic shifts at the end of the Ice Age that reconfigured habitats and food webs. A third entertains a mixed model where humans and climate acted together to reshape faunal communities. Mythic elements are woven through indigenous oral histories in ways scholars are still attentive to, tales of enormous creatures that shaped rivers and moved boulders, of primordial contests between people and beasts, and of ancestors who learned the secret of cooperative hunting. Picture yourself on an exposed gravel bar, finding a giant rib with clean-cut marks and imagining the breath of the animal still fogging in cold air centuries later, while the world around it, river, grass, human life, rearranged itself. The reflective insight is ecological humility. Humans have always acted within broader environmental systems, and the disappearance of giants is a shared legacy that reconfigures myth, diet, and landscape. Still, for all the radiocarbon dates and detailed taphonomic studies, we still don't know exactly how human behavior and rapid environmental change combined in specific localities to produce the observed extinction patterns in Illinois. We still don't know. Consider the quiet yet disruptive traces left by early collectors and amateur excavators, a history of discovery that is as much human as the artifacts themselves. One sentence. The 19th and early 20th century rush to collect mounds, skeletons, and curiosities gave us catalogs that are invaluable and incomplete at once. because many objects lost their context the moment someone lifted them into a box. Museum drawers filled with beads and gorgets tell a story of curiosity, scientific zeal, and ethical blind spots. Early excavation notes can be precise or slapdash, and provenance is sometimes reduced to a single place name scratched on a tag. Key archival discoveries, field journals, old maps, and fragmented correspondence sometimes allow modern researchers to reconstruct original find spots and reattach objects to landscapes, but more often they expose gaps. A pottery sherd listed only as "found near Springfield" is a half sentence in a long human story. Interpretations vary. Some historians of archaeology celebrate these early collectors as salvagers who preserved materials that would otherwise have been lost. Critics emphasize the violence of removal and the loss of contextual information that would have told richer stories about social practice. Mythic elements enter when old collectors embellish stories to sell or to sensationalize. A giant skeleton here, a sacrificial human there, and those narratives sometimes embed themselves in local lore, shaping how descendants view a place. Picture yourself leafing through a Brittlefield notebook under warm lamplight, and feeling a shiver as an entry mentions a mound with curious stones that later cannot be located. The gap between the written note and the vanished place is a form of archaeological absence. The reflective insight is ethical. The past is not only a field of facts but also a moral landscape, in which the practices of collection and display shape present-day relationships between scholars, descendant communities, and the public. Still, for all the archival recovery work and repatriation efforts that return objects to communities, we still don't know what many of those early acts of removal destroyed in terms of context and meaning, and we still don't know the full consequences of those losses for reconstructing past lives. We still don't know. Finally, picture the slow, human act of remembering, elders at a table, hands tracing the outline of a map, the slow cadence of a language that encodes a place name tied to a flood, a hill, or a stone. One sentence. Oral traditions and living memory extend the archaeological record in directions that artifacts alone cannot reach, and they offer paths to interpretive honesty that respect both science and community. Ethnographers and indigenous knowledge holders have shown that stories transmitted across generations often encode ecological data, place-based histories, and social norms, sometimes matching the physical record in remarkable ways. For example, flood stories may align with sedimentary evidence for inundation. Clan migration narratives can be consistent with isotopic evidence for mobility, and ritual tales can map onto repeated ceremonial architecture. But here's where it gets tricky. Oral histories change, adapt, and sometimes absorb new elements, which can make direct correlation with the material record complicated, yet dismissing them as mere myths risks erasing crucial strands of meaning. Competing approaches to integrating oral tradition with archaeology range from collaborative frameworks that center descendant voices and research design to more extractive models where oral data are cherry-picked to support preconceived hypotheses. Mythic resonance is not a bug but a feature. These stories bind people to place, confer moral authority, and shape how landscapes are used and remembered. Picture yourself in a kitchen as an elder speaks of a winter when the river rose and took a village, and then standing a week later on a core where charcoal marks indicate a contemporaneous burn event. The overlap is a rush of human scale into scientific data. The reflective insight here is methodological and ethical. The past is co-authored by many forms of knowledge, and our reconstructions are strongest when they are collaborative. Still, for all the promising convergences between oral memory and stratigraphic records, we still don't know which threads in a multilayered narrative are literal memory and which are later interpretive retellings. And we still don't know how to weigh these forms of evidence without imposing modern hierarchies of truth. We still don't know. If you follow the faint lines of exchange that braid the Midwest, you find that Illinois was never an island. It was a hub in a continental conversation that moved copper from the northern lakes, shells from the Gulf, mica from the Appalachians, and ideas in every direction. The pattern scholars call the Hopewell interaction sphere, not a single empire but a web of ritual exchange visible in astonishing assemblages of exotic goods, reminds us that prestige objects traveled long distances and that social meanings traveled with them. In a single mound assemblage you can find a copper ornament whose chemistry points north to Lake Superior, a lightning whelk shell whose shape came from the Gulf, and chipped stone from quarries hundreds of miles away. Those objects imply networks of exchange, obligation, and shared ritual vocabulary across vast distances. Some researchers read the distribution of such goods as evidence of elite-driven accumulation and long-distance diplomacy. Others emphasized decentralized reciprocity and seasonal gatherings where objects circulated among equals. Picture a winter night when traders gather by a fire to exchange beads and stories. The objects are small, portable histories, and imagine how one rare shell might reshape an alliance or mark a new ritual. The evidence for extensive movement is strong and technical, isotopes and petrography and strata, but the human mechanisms remain debated. Who decided the rules of exchange? How were objects used to cement relationships? And how often did these networks break and reform? We still don't know. The matter of the dead in Illinois makes this doubt painfully specific. Museums and excavators once treated burial mounds as cabinets of curiosities. The Dixon Mounds Museum famously displayed burials in ways that later generations found deeply troubling and disrespectful. Those early practices gave the public a window into prehistoric lives but also stripped context and agency from descendant communities, forcing a rethinking of how archaeology and museums should behave. In recent years, Illinois institutions have faced lawsuits, reforms, and new laws that push for repatriation and reburial, and those moral reckonings change how we can talk about the past. Artifacts and skeletons are not mere data, they are relatives with living descendants who deserve voice and respect. The legal and ethical frameworks, from NAGPRA to newer state statutes, have accelerated the return of remains and associated objects, but they have also exposed how many original contexts were lost long before preservation was possible. Picture an archive where a dusty tag says only, "Found near," and imagine the philosophical ache of trying to rebuild a life from those fragments while also returning them to a people who remember them as ancestors. The result is a necessary tension between scientific inquiry and cultural justice. Both matter, and they must be reconciled in practice, not just in words. We still don't know. There are places where the earth keeps a layered autobiography, and one of the richest such books is the Koster site on the Illinois River, a succession of horizons that read like chapters stacked in the soil, preserving sometimes 8,000 years of human adaptation. You can stand at a trench and watch humanity change, from archaic hunters with delicate points to woodland pottery traditions and finally to Mississippian maize-based life, and feel the slow, cumulative strategies of people learning to live here. The microstratigraphy, the charred seeds, the post holes that mark house after house, these are the devices by which archaeologists tell long-run stories of resilience and invention. Some scholars argue these sequences represent largely local adaptation and incremental change, while others highlight moments of punctuated transformation sparked by migration, climatic stress, or borrowed technologies. Imagine the patience of people who stored seeds, mended nets, and taught their children the same river channels for generations, and then imagine a sudden drought or a social rupture that sends the whole sequence off course. Koster is one of the places where the evidence is thick enough to suggest answers, but even here the human motives behind shifts, why a new pottery style took hold, how kin networks rewired themselves, remain partly opaque. We still don't know. On the bluff above the river, the Piasa image lives between recorded observation and living myth, a startling reminder that some marks on the land become talismans of memory and imagination. The 17th century voyagers who wrote about a painted, monstrous bird gave the Piasa its first inked life in European archives, but oral traditions and regional imagery suggest a more layered visual tradition that could predate those accounts. The painted figure, part bird, part serpent, part panther in some retellings, sits at the intersection of symbol and story. Was it a clan emblem visible to river traffic, a mythic guardian whose image deterred enemies, or a visual sermon about boundaries and cosmology? Weather and human repainting make pigment dating difficult, complicating attempts to pin a single origin or meaning on the image, and the story that the frontier later told about cannibalistic monsters reveals as much about settler imagination as about indigenous iconography. Picture a mist lifting from the river to reveal the red outline of a creature, the canoe's oars slowing as breath catches. That moment is where image and memory meet. The Piasa teaches us that images on cliffs are not inert. They are living, remade by each generation that looks up and tells a story about what they see. We still don't know. Beneath the fields, in the gravel pits and peat deposits, the bones of mastodons and the traces of humans sometimes touch in ways that pull us back to the end of the Ice Age and to the uncomfortable question of extinction. Illinois has produced Pleistocene remains, mastodon and mammoth bones in clay and gravel, and the occasional association of human tools with large animal remains raises debates about ancient hunting and coexistence. Some finds suggest direct interaction, cut marks or tool associations that point to human processing of megafauna, and those data encourage models in which human predation played a role in local declines. Other lines of evidence emphasize rapid climatic shifts as the dominant driver, with people and beasts responding to a transforming landscape in different ways. Whatever the mechanism, the disappearance of giants like mastodons changed the ecological theater and the human script, forcing new subsistence patterns, technologies, and mythic accounts of a world that once held enormous animals. Picture standing beside a broken tusk in a muddy clay pit, and feeling the sudden scale of a vanished world. The bone is a hinge, but the story that turns on it is contested. We still don't know. Throughout all these technical debates, the politics of memory has shifted in recent years as lawmakers, museums, and tribes try to right old wrongs while forging new partnerships. Illinois has moved toward more proactive repatriation and has enacted laws to allow reburial on ancestral ground, changes that attempt to restore some agency to descendant communities and heal wounds created by centuries of removal and study. Those legal frameworks create new opportunities for collaborative research that centers community knowledge and ethical care, but they also pose practical challenges, cataloging thousands of remains, negotiating cultural affiliation, and balancing scholarly interests with the urgent needs of families and nations seeking closure. The procedural work, inventories, notices, consultations, is slow and sometimes contentious, but it reshapes who gets to tell the story of place. Imagine the relief in an elder's face when an ancestor is returned for a proper ceremony. Imagine, too, the scholarly humility required to accept that some objects and stories should no longer be treated as neutral data but as living parts of a people's heritage. The future of Illinois archaeology is ethical as much as it is scientific. How we proceed will determine not only what we know, but who is allowed to shape what that knowledge will mean. We still don't know. We still don't know, and that refrain is not a failure, but an invitation. Stand in any one of these places long enough and the contours of the past will begin to exert themselves. A bead glints in the soil, a buried beam yields its tree-ring secrets, an elder's story aligns with a charcoal horizon. Each time the threads knit together we get closer to what those lives felt like, but they will always be partial, dotted with gaps that call for imagination as much as for method. So we keep digging, sampling, listening, and crucially, listening to those whose memories are part of the living landscape, trusting that a fuller story requires science and storytelling in equal measure. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.